Hey there, just quickly, this video is actually part of a much larger video that I uploaded back in 2022. Heads up, there are some minor changes from that video. Mostly, I just don't score on a decimal point system anymore, so some numbers have since changed. Even so, here is the 12th Doctor's era, and let's get straight into it. So before I start tearing this series to pieces, I should disclose that I am a huge Capaldi fan. He is my joint favourite Doctor, along with the 8th Doctor, the 10th Doctor and the 4th Doctor. But his first series isn't that great. Most of his episodes aren't good, and it kind of sucks. I will state though, right off the bat, him as the 12th Doctor, Capaldi that is, instantly brilliant. I love how cynical and just overall done with everything Capaldi is. It's really cool. I really love this new aspect after so many giddy Doctors. Yeah, it's cool. I love the idea of an old Doctor, and for this series, Clara ain't great in my opinion. I think that Jenna Coleman does a good job with what she's given, but there's not much of a connection between her and Capaldi for this series, and it really does drag down the characters. But that being said, let's get into the actual episodes themselves. So the first episode is Deep Breath, and if this was just a regular 45 to 50 minute episode, this would be one of my favourites. But the episode's about 70 minutes long. 30 minutes of that is solid padding for some reason. So much of the episode is just basically looking at Clara's reaction to the Doctor regenerating, and as important as that is, it's something that fans have seen multiple times before by this point. It's nothing surprising, so I don't get why everyone's treating it like this is the first regeneration of Modern Who. Yeah, that happens. Pretty much the entire world knows it by this point, so there's no one really you're teaching about this. I also think just so much of the Paternoster Gang is there for padding. I don't really know how to describe this episode, because there's so many amazing concepts and moments. Everything with Capaldi is truly brilliant. But the pacing is very similar to Series 7. It's just not there. It's way too padded, and it did not need such a stupid runtime. It's still a 7 out of 10, all because of Capaldi. For our second episode of this series, we have Into the Dalek, and yep, big Dalek fan, so I hear the word Dalek and I'm instantly intrigued. And it's good. Not great, but it's good. I love all the stuff with Rusty becoming like a good Dalek, the Doctor being called a good Dalek. That's really cool. The joke, "Are you out of your mind? No, I'm inside a Dalek," is my favourite Doctor Who joke of all time. It makes me laugh every time. But it's got this weird feeling to it that it's just not very fun. The episode seems very dry of humour at times, very soulless. But yeah, it's still a good episode, it's just very drab at times, and it has that big issue that Series 8 has of just feeling kinda dull. It's a 7 out of 10, but it could have been much higher if it was in a different series. Speaking of my favourite Doctor Who jokes, we have Robot of Sherwood, which does have my second favourite joke of Doctor Who history, with the "Has anyone ever punched you in the face? Not yet. Lucky I'm here then." Oh great, love Capaldi once again. I also love the idea of Robin Hood being kind of real but also really not, and how it kind of conflicts with the Doctor's opinions on time and reality. It really does draw into question this character's knowledge, and it makes it so interesting to see them not really accept that they could ever be wrong. Robin Hood's also great, and Clara's a lot more interesting in this episode from the last one, but everything else about the episode is very bog standard. It's not overly entertaining. The villain is just kind of weak, and the actual robots themselves aren't very threatening, so you don't really feel like there's many stakes to the episode, and it really drags it down. Once again, the awful pacing of this series. What is it with Series 7 and 8 just having bad pacing? But yeah, it's a 6 out of 10. Could have been a lot better. Up next though is Listen, and it's definitely the start of the highlights of Series 8, as it does have quite a few highlights. Now, personally, I don't find it as good as many people say, but I still find it creepy. I still don't fully understand what that shadow thing was that moved the bed, if it was actually no one to begin with. But no, it's got that amazing style that Stephen Moffat brings to Doctor Who, with the timey-wimey stuff almost becoming like sort of horror movies, and an element of Blink is definitely in this. And I do enjoy it for all that aspect. I love seeing the Doctor's childhood being explored a little bit. All the stuff with future Danny Pink, which is completely broken in the timeline. And I also really like Clara in this episode. She really does show how much she truly cares about the Doctor no matter whose face he's wearing. And it really just started to strengthen their relationship, which would fall apart throughout this series. But yeah, it's still a great episode and a solid 8 out of 10. Speaking of solid episodes, it's time for the second part in a pretty good trilogy of decent episodes in Series 8 with Time Heist. Now, this episode is essentially like a Mission Impossible styled bank heist, cool guy, over-the-top thing, but done in the style of Doctor Who with weird sci-fi shenanigans. And I really enjoy it. I love the monster in this being actually a good guy that's being controlled by just greedy people. I love the supporting characters in this episode. I think they're both fleshed out really well and could almost fit into the TARDIS team with no real questions from me. And Capaldi and Clara, once again, just showing how well they can actually get on together. It's really cool. I love this episode, and it's definitely a highlight of the series for me. It's an 8 out of 10. Next up is The Caretaker, and this is just a fun episode. No, it's not that great, but all the stuff with the Clara versus the Doctor, I really like. Also, I've just realised I called her The Clara. I think I'm going to do that for the rest of this video, so I'm leaving this bit in. So, throughout the episode, The Clara is trying to talk to Danny and basically deal with all their drama going on, which is a bit boring, I will state, and it's the biggest weak point of the episode. But all the stuff with the Doctor calling Danny PE, I do find really funny. You must be only into over-the-top manly things. And especially with it being the Doctor themselves, I do find that an interesting thing to once again, this series' main positive is showing the flaws of the Doctor. And it plays heavily into Capaldi/12's main motivation throughout his era of am I a good man? I love the monster, like the little robot killing machine. I think it's cool. Coal Hill School is also a great place to come back to after so many years. So for me, it's another 8 out of 10. Just could have done with a bit more polish. And then we have Kill the Moon, which completely ruins the flow that this series was starting to get. So for this episode, the Clara and the Doctor go onto the moon with an annoying kid from the previous episode. And the moon is a giant egg, and yeah, it's just not great. Honestly, all of this episode is really bland to really bad, apart from one bit. And it's when the Doctor tells Clara, this is your problem, you can deal with it. I think that's so cool. It's something we've not seen the Doctor do. I think it plays heavily onto the relationship of the Doctor and Clara throughout this series, which is massively under turmoil throughout it, and I like that in some aspects. And then when it comes to this episode, it's handled brilliantly. I just wish that the episode wasn't a pro-life abortion commentary. No, it's not a good episode. It's a solid 4 out of 10, and it's mostly elevated by just that moment between the Clara and the Doctor. Following on from the last episode, this was originally sort of meant to be Clara's final story, and Mummy on the Orient Express would have been an amazing send-off to the character. Honestly, it's the best episode so far this series, and in my opinion, it's the best episode of this series. I love the setting, I love how it's basically an Agatha Christie story again, and it's done so well. All the jokes of Aggie My Mummy, once again, nostalgia baiting works on me, so I love that stuff. Clara's very good in this episode. Why was she not this great throughout the rest of the story so far? Her connection with the Doctor is also really interesting to watch, with them both thinking it's the last time, until realising that they just love it too much to stop. Now, the murders and stuff is cool. I love the train conducting guy. He's really neat. And all, the kills are so terrifying to watch. What would you do in that scenario? The only bit that lets it down is the ending, where it just suddenly explodes and it doesn't make much sense. But still, it's a 9 out of 10. Love this story. time for Flatline, where the Clara literally takes on the role of the Doctor and does it surprisingly well. So, throughout the series, a lot of stuff had been building up between the Clara and the Doctor, and for this episode, the Clara basically takes the role of them. It's quite good. I love the fact that the Doctor is stuck in the TARDIS but just keeps shrinking. I find it really funny. All the stuff with the Clara basically getting her own companion throughout the story with Rixie, and then having to deal with these 2D monsters trying to break into a 3D plane. All really cool. I love the concept of this one. I think that they should play around with 2D and 3D environments more in Doctor Who. Really cool. It's aesthetically very pleasing. The deaths are terrifying in this one. Why is it suddenly that the last 2 episodes have had terrifying death? No, and the Clara really does shine throughout the whole thing. Jenna Coleman does an amazing performance. No, it's a great episode. It's a solid 9 out of 10 for me. Love this one as well. Then we hit the biggest roadblock in the planet with In the Forest of the Night, and it's bad. Oh, it's so bad. The only thing about this episode, which is not going to give it a 1 or 2 out of 10, because I'll just get this out of the way first, I love the environment. I think it's beautiful. I also like Doctor versus Clara in this episode. It really builds up to the finale. But everything else is bad. The Doctor acts like a selfish little arsehole throughout the episode. Clara acts like an entitled little bitch throughout the whole episode. Danny acts like such an arrogant fucker throughout the episode. How am I meant to root for any 3 of these people during this argument when they all keep lying and manipulating each other? I don't like any of them in this episode. The kids are all annoying, the actual plot itself is basically nonsensical, I don't care about this little girl. But like I said, the visuals are really pretty at times, and some of the moments between the characters are decent. It's a 3 out of 10, but just barely. That's when we finally reach the series finale for Series A, and it's Dark Water / Death in Heaven. Now, personally, I really like this finale, even with it having very obvious faults. First up, it's our first 2-parter since the goddamn Flesh People, which is, 3 years ago by this point in the show, and goddamn it was about time. I also love all the concept for heaven basically being like this weird, almost cloud-like thing. And of course, I can't not mention Michelle Gomez as Missy. Missy is my favourite incarnation of the Master because I feel like there's just so much more to her than just evil villain. All the stuff with Unit is also great, as well as all the stuff with Clara at the start. I adore the opening sequence where Clara keeps destroying the keys, but the issue is, it's very boring. Yeah, despite all my praise, oh my god, this could have been like an hour special. So much padding happens. Yeah, it's an 8 out of 10 for me. I don't think it's as bad as people say, but it's definitely not perfect. And that rounds up Series 8 with the last episode / Christmas special, Last Christmas. Now, this was originally meant to be the last episode to feature Jenna Coleman as Clara, thus the part where she gets old at the end. But overall, I think this episode's pretty decent. I love Alien, and this movie is literally Doctor Who does Alien again. They even point it out, and it has another one of my favourite Capaldi jokes with the "no wonder they keep invading you" line. Gets me every time. I also really, really like all the stuff with Santa and the elves. It shows from the beginning that something's not quite right, and it does play heavily into the dreamscape feel of this episode, almost like it mixes Alien and A Nightmare on Elm Street. But honestly, my biggest issue with this episode is that it is so obviously structured as a farewell to Clara, with her basically taking centre stage throughout the story, that the fact she stays undermines it in my opinion. I think it could have been a better episode if she left and this was a new companion joining. Still though, great episode, 8 out of 10. So that was Series A, and up now is the ratings for each episode. And I don't hate this series, it's definitely the weakest of the first 10, no questions asked. And it's just got so many episodes which are just around the average mark to bad, but also some really good ones that I think people overlook a lot of the times, especially stuff such as Time Heist. I think that was just a really fun episode. Then we switch over to the rankings, and yeah, as you can see, the top half are all really positive. I really like those episodes, but especially at the start of the series, It doesn't start off very great, and a couple of times when it seems like it's getting better and better, the show just dips very significantly with a couple of episodes. So yeah, Series 8 wasn't exactly the best start for Capaldi, and when it comes to ratings, the show really started to drop off here. And I can see why, but I don't think this series deserves the hate it gets. It's just very underwhelming at points. Up next is Series 9, and personally, I know this series has a very mixed reception, but I think it's a massive improvement on Series 8. As I've stated a few times before, I'm a big fan of two-parters. I love two-parter stories, so the fact that most of this series is set up of just two-parters really speaks to me personally, and after so many series of not really getting them, it's cool to see so many at once. I also really like the relationship between the Doctor and Clara in this series, where it's basically like they're just friends now, they're no longer travelling companions, so Clara's not even in every episode, which I think is pretty cool, and it almost makes it like a companion light series in some aspects. I like that. I'm also quite into the recurring narrative of the hybrid, but I do think that it's stated so many times in this series, it's no shock it became a meme on TARDIS posting. So yeah, Series 9, I'd say it's definitely better, but let's see if I can justify that by going into the actual episodes themselves. First up is The Magician's Apprentice and The Witch's Familiar, and honestly I think it's the first time the Daleks were done true justice throughout the Stephen Moffat era. I love all the stuff at the start where Missy and the Clara are basically trying to figure out what the hell's going on with the Doctor, and Unit are very confused. I also love all the flashback stuff with Davros as a kid, and it really does finally answer that question from the Fourth Doctor's era of, do I have the right? I also just love the general relationship between the Doctor and Davros. It's really cool to see how different these characters are, but how much they almost kind of respect each other in a way. However, the biggest issue of this episode is that there is a lot of just talking. It's more just a lot of dialogue explaining backstories, but when you've got Daleks, maybe do something with the, Daleks. I still think it's a great couple of episodes though, and a solid start to the series, so for me, it's an 8 out of 10. For our second two-part story of Series 9, we have Under the Lake and Before the Flood. Now, this two-parter is a weird one for me. I really love the first episode. I think it's truly incredible, terrifying, usual base and prestige stuff, but with ghosts. I also really like all the supporting characters. I think they're very interesting. I really like the dynamic with the deaf girl. I think that's just cool to put into the show. I also like the Doctor and Clara's relationship, where they've basically almost turned into a bickering married couple, which I kind of like, and I think it works really well. And all the stuff with the ghosts is really cool. It's really creepy, definitely very horror levels of stuff. And the second half is where a lot of it falls apart, in my opinion. I'm not the biggest fan of all the stuff with the sarcophagus and all the timey-wimey stuff, and the Fisher King itself, even though it's a cool design, he doesn't actually do much in the context of the story, apart from basically being a Resident Evil boss. That reaches our third two-part story with The Girl Who Died / The Woman Who Lived. Now, I know that these episodes can be seen separately, but personally I think you'd be very confused if you only watched the second half without watching the first half, but it feels enough for a two-part story in my opinion. I like a lot of the character elements. I actually quite like Me. I think she's a very interesting concept. I also like all the stuff with Odin and the weird robot-y things. I think that's all pretty neat, and for the second half, I like the lion guy. No, his effects look terrible, but as a villain, I do find him at least a bit threatening. However, everything else of this two-part just falls apart for me. For some reason, both these settings just seem really bland and cheap. I also don't like the way that Me changes so much between the first half and the second half. There's just so many little issues of this story that really compound up, with the main issue being that they're both very padded and very boring to me. So for these ones, I'm going to give them a 4 out of 10. Up next, we have the Zygon Invasion and the Zygon Inversion. Now, this is a two-parter that I love. I'm a big fan of the Zygons. I think the idea of them is pretty cool. All the stuff with the Doctor and Unit is really cool. I love how many twists this episode has. All the stuff with Clara/Bonnie, that is so good. Jenna Coleman does such an incredible job as both characters. I also love how this episode basically has Osgood as a companion. I am a big fan of Osgood, so all that stuff is really cool to me. Then, of course, we can't not mention the ending to this story. Capaldi's speech is breathtaking. He is such an incredible actor. Now, when it comes to my issues of this episode, it is completely down to that scene at the church where the military guys are like, hey, these guys can shapeshift into anyone. Then they shapeshift into their family members and they're like, oh my god, that's my actual family member. What are you doing here? It's so stupid. But apart from that one scene, everything else about this is incredible. Solid 9 out of 10. Time for our first solo episode with Sleep No More. And if you've ever been on the internet, you know that this episode isn't exactly great, and I kind of agree with that. Personally, I really have to say I love the found footage format. I think it's done so well. I also think it's really clever how over time they start seeing stuff from other people's point of view who don't have the cameras, showing that something is definitely up. It's something I noticed in my first watch and a lot of other people didn't, and I think that just shows how well it's done. It's very subtle, and they don't point it out until the end. I also love all the stuff with Mr. Sandman, the actual corporation stuff, and then the biggest issue of this episode is the biggest issue that's with a lot of found footage stuff. It's very slow, very tedious, very boring, and we don't see much that goes on. I still think it's an interesting experiment, but it just doesn't hit it at all. It's very dull, and because of that I have to give it a 5 out of 10. For our second and technically last solo episode of this series, it's Face for Raven. I will openly state, Clara's death is heartbreaking. I'm not going to deny that. Her getting brought back later on down the line really contradicts it, as I'll state in a little bit. No, it's done brilliantly. Her accepting her failure, her trying to be the Clara, and the Doctor being the Doctor. She doesn't seem to understand, and didn't understand throughout her tenure, that she can't be the Doctor. And I think that really falls her downfall and works so well for the characters. However, I do think there's a reason that when it comes to this episode, people only really point out that scene, and it's because the rest of it is very standard. The only reason why it's overly notable is that it's episode 10 and it suddenly kills off a companion. But everything else about the episode is boring. I don't care too much about this hidden room. Why would the Cybermen who have no emotions want to hide from humanity and all that stuff? It's just a bit bland, but that ending, brilliant. Up next, a lot of people are going to hate me because I've ranked these two together, and it's Heaven Sent and Hell Bent. Now, obviously, Heaven Sent, absolutely incredible. It's a time loop episode, and Capaldi monologues for about 50 minutes. It is truly some of the greatest television that the show has ever put out, no questions asked. And the second half with Hell Bent, I know a lot of people have big issues with it. Personally though, I do like Hellbent as well. I don't get the big negative reception for it online. I think it's not as good as Heaven Sent, but not much other things could be as good as Heaven Sent. I still think it does a lot of characterisation for the Doctor, where they don't want to accept loss, which is something that the character has had since the first Doctor. As well as all the stuff with the Time Lords I think is pretty neat. I love the idea of like the vault thingy. The only issue I honestly have is the ending. I really don't like the diner scene. I love the acting between Capaldi and Coleman. Even so, incredible two-parter in my opinion. 9 out of 10. For our last story of Series 9, I've included The Husbands of River Song, because personally I think it does work quite well to fit in with Series 9's focus on loss and death. So for this story, we have River coming back, and her and Capaldi have such amazing chemistry. I am still sad to this day. This is the only time they appear on screen together in this episode. I also really love the plot, all the stuff that we see with River basically doing what River does, but seeing it from the Doctor's perspective. That's really cool, because a lot of times we don't really see what River does, we see the aftermath. So seeing her actually do all these really dodgy deals and all these criminal under things, And of course, the ending, How Long is a Night in Beryllium? Oh, that hits me so hard. Honestly, my only real issue with this episode is that Nardole isn't very important to it, despite the fact it being a major character going forward. But apart from that, it's one of the most heartbreaking endings for a companion. Solid 9 out of 10. And that is Series 9. Overall, I'd say it's definitely an improvement on both the past two series. It's still a little bit mixed at some points. I really love the idea of a two-part structure, and as you can see right here with my ratings, overall the two-parters are really good apart from one, which most people don't even count as a two-parter. And when we change it over to the rankings, it's basically all two-parters at the top, with the only two-parter being at the bottom, once again being the one that most people wouldn't count as one anyway. So, yeah, it's just a really good idea. I just wish that a couple of the ideas were thought through more. Like, Face the Raven was obviously only built for its finale, and all that other stuff. So, anyway, still a great series, and definitely a step up from the last two, but there's definite room for improvement, and the next series definitely does that improvement. Series 10. What else really can be said apart from the redeemer of the Moffat era and especially of the Capaldi era? Now, I know some people for some reason take issue with Bill for being a lesbian, completely ignoring the fact that all the other straight companions have had massive melodrama with relationships. But no, I just really love Series 10. I think it goes back to the consistency of Series 1 and Series 4. It's definitely one of my favourites, as there's not even a single episode that I fully dislike. There's one that I'm not a fan of, and one that I'll usually skip, but apart from that single episode, everything else throughout this awesome series is so damn fun to watch. I also adore Pearl Mackie as Bill. I think she's one of the best companions the show's ever had for just how normal she is. And, you know, Matt Lucas as Nardole is a brilliant addition, with Capaldi really shining throughout this series, taking on a more mentor role compared to his more mental breakdown role. But, yeah, let's just get into the episodes, because I really do love this series. For our first episode, we have the return of Dr. Mysterio, which is, yes, technically a Christmas special, but it also really fits into this series quite well, whilst also capping off Series 9 with a couple of references. Now, when it comes to this special, it needs to be acknowledged that Doctor Who wasn't on the air for a whole year by the time this special came out, so I think there was a lot of hype going into it, and a lot of people got disappointed because of that, and I completely understand, but you are wrong. Now, this episode's not incredible. It's very cheesy, very Christmassy, very happy-go-lucky with random aliens. But when it comes to the characters and the comedy, this episode nails it. I hadn't watched this episode since its release until a couple of weeks ago, and oh my god, it is so funny. It's absolutely brilliant. The plot is appalling, but every character and every comedy line in this episode hits so well, it's easily forgivable. It's a solid 7 out of 10 for me. For the first proper episode of Series 10, we have the pilot. Now, originally, I was going to rate this episode lower, but upon rewatch, it's actually a really good episode. Everything throughout the series is established very subtly, without you even really noticing so much that it distracts you from the story. And when it comes to the story itself, it's a good one. It's usual Doctor Who-y sci-fi stuff, but has that weird twist partway towards the ending, which I really enjoy. The fact there's no real villains in this episode. Of course, we also can't forget how amazing 12 is throughout this episode with Peter Capaldi, and of course Nardole. And then Bill. Instantly lovable in my opinion. I love everything to do with Bill. The fact that was basically an underachiever, that is actually very intelligent, and he sees so much potential in her. Now, I love their relationship. This is a good episode. Solid 8 out of 10. For the second episode, we have Smile, and once again, I see this as an episode a bit like The Return of Dr. Mysterio, that people basically watched a trailer and said, I'm out. Those people are so wrong. Yes, the emoji bots are very cringy at some points, and it is a massive detraction from the episode, but the overall story, Absolutely awesome. Bill is fleshed out so much in this with how she reacts to stuff with all the sci-fi concepts, how she reacts to the Doctor, the moral choices that you have to make as a companion. All that is brilliant. I also really like some of the supporting cast, like the kid who isn't actually annoying somehow, and the actual swarm things, creepy as hell. Love it. And after a while, you do get sort of used to the emoji bots with them being cute at certain moments. But yeah, great episode, solid 8 out of 10 once again. That leads on to the third episode with Thin Ice, and I think it's a little bit less good than the first two, but still good. Of course, this episode is mostly famous for the Doctor punching a racist, and that scene alone would have given this episode a 10 out of 10 if that was the whole episode. Just the Doctor keep punching a racist in the face. But when it comes to the actual story, I do like it, but I almost feel like this episode should have been a two-parter. There's a lot of cogs in this machine when it comes to the plot of this episode. And a lot of them just feel very brushed aside, like the homeless kids are just kind of brushed aside. The horrific rich guy exploiting people and knowing that they're going to die is kind of brushed aside as well. I just don't think it has enough room to breathe at times, but the overall concept is awesome. I love the actual kind of whale thing itself, and the setting is beautiful. I also love the fact they acknowledge Bill's race, which is something that they needed to do more with Martha. But yeah, it's still a good episode. It's an 8 out of 10. Fourth episode is Knock Knock, and this is when the series really starts to take off for me. I honestly love Knock Knock. It's almost like a kind of Hammer horror film, but done in the style of Doctor Who, a bit like some of the classic serials from series 12 to season 14. That's really cool to me. I love how just there's so much mystery surrounding it. The Doctor's relationship with Bill is also done really well. I like a lot of Bill's friends, even if they are kind of dicks. But they're kind of the likeable dicks that I've made friends with throughout uni. I love you guys. Please don't get mad that I called you lovable dicks. And then there's just so much more to the episode. All the stuff with the relationship between the mother and the son. Heartbreaking. All that stuff with the house looks beautiful. I love the episode's design. It's so pretty, but yet so creepy. My only real issue with this episode is that I feel like it could have been a few minutes longer just to expand more on the mother and son thing. But apart from that, it's awesome as this episode. 9 out of 10. Up next is Oxygen, and this episode has some amazing commentary. Now, I know a lot of people take issue with this episode of how anti-capitalist it is, but personally I don't see it as anti-capitalist, more anti what capitalism could become down the line. And with that subtlety, I do actually quite like it, and I think the kind of political message in this episode is subtle enough that it's still clever without being too obvious, which is something that won't be true further on down the line. I also love the setting. It's so creepy, it's so empty, it's so dead. Like, this is one of the few times in Doctor Who that I truly feel that they are alone in space, and it works really well. Of course, the Doctor going blind is also brilliant. All the stuff with Bill and Nardole is also incredible, with Nardole finally being a proper companion. My only real downside to this episode is that the supporting characters are very forgettable. I don't really remember what any of them did, and that does really let the episode down, but it's still a great episode and another solid 8 out of 10. Now it's time for a 3-part story, our first one in a very long time, and currently most recent one. The first episode, Extremis, is truly outstanding for this series. All the stuff with Bill getting walked in on by the Pope after saying if there was anything wrong with being a lesbian, there'd be a sign. So funny. It's one of my favourite jokes in the whole show. Perfect, and the twist is so good. But then we get to Pyramid at the End of the World, and I still like this episode. I still think it's a great episode, but it has one of those hell-bent problems where, because the first one was so good, it could never live up to it. And this episode, as great as it is, it's very talky. Then finally, when it comes to Lie of the Land, I think it's such a disappointment. So rushed. It's difficult to keep up, really, with what's happening at times. And the ending is basically just the Leaf thing that Clara did. Yeah, overall, I do like this 3-part, but 7 out of 10. I just wish the ending was better. For our 8th story, we have Empress of Mars, and I'll be honest, it's not a great story. I love all the stuff with the British basically trying to take over Mars. I think that's just kind of funny and a good jab at colonisation. All the stuff with the Ice Warriors, once again, I'm a huge Ice Warrior fan and a big Mark Gatiss fan, so seeing them both on another episode, that's really cool to me, especially after Cold War. I also love how in this episode, specifically, they show that there's good and bad Ice Warriors, because in the classics, the Ice Warriors were a very difficult monster, due to the fact that they did change. But everything else about this episode, especially its pacing, feels really boring. I don't like the main villain at all. He's just too dislikable to actually be realistic. And overall, as cool as the Queen's design is, she doesn't do much. It's like introducing something that they didn't really care about. I still think it's a good episode, but I'm gonna have to give it a 7 out of 10, and I can't give it any higher or any lower. Now we reach the only episode of this series that I think is kind of boring, like very boring, and that's Theatres of Light. I really appreciate all the stuff that they did with the Romans and Bill. All those scenes are really cool. I also really like the Doctor and Nardole dealing with the more indigenous people. I think it's to Scotland. And then the rest of it, I just don't like. There's nothing inherently bad about this episode, it's just very middle of the road. Whilst at some other points, especially that ending, it's just very cliched, very cheesy, not very entertaining as well. You're just kind of watching it and waiting for it to end. Like I said, it's not a bad episode, but I wouldn't even say it's an average episode, so it's gotta be a 4 out of 10. Kind of a shame too, since it's written by someone who wrote from the classic series. Now we reach the 2-part finale of the Capaldi era. All I'll say for this 2-parter is it is the best series finale. It hits me so hard throughout the whole thing. Capaldi is incredible. Everything with Missy and the Master, brilliant. All the stuff with Bill, amazing. Nardole's exit is heartbreaking with him learning how to care about people again. I love the supporting characters in both halves of the story, especially like the little farmyard group, the cyber designs, bringing back all the classic ones, mixing them with the brand new ones, and just all the stuff to do with that last 10 minutes, with the Doctor pleading the Master and Missy to stay with him. I can't sing this episode's praises enough. I watch it at least once a year since its release, and I nearly cry every single time. It is the best finale for the modern era, and it's a 10 out of 10. Then finally, for the last episode of Series 10, we have Twice Upon a Time. I don't get why people hate this episode. I get some of the criticisms for the first Doctor being a bit more sexist, but watching those classic serials, he was quite sexist. So I personally don't mind. I think it was just the mindset of the time. And no, it's not acceptable to modern day standards, but at the time that wouldn't have even been blinked at. And I think the episode represents that quite well. Then on to all the other stuff, absolutely outstanding. The ending makes me cry like a little baby. All the stuff with Bill coming back and basically saying her proper goodbyes is awesome. Clara's cameo, Nardole's cameo, all the stuff with Rusty coming back from Capaldi's first series, the Brigadier's great uncle, all the stuff with the First World War, heartbreaking. No, I love this story. I love the fact there's no real villain. And yeah, all the stuff like the mainframe, really cool. It's another 10 out of 10. So that's Series 10. Overall, it's one of my favourite series of the show, with only one episode being the outlier. As you can see from the ratings, it's pretty damn consistent apart from one, and when we change it over to the rankings, yeah, there's literally just one episode that's rated a 6 or below. World Enough in Time of the Doctor Falls is obviously at number 1. Now, this is a series which is basically completely standalone, and I love that, and I think it really works in its favour, kind of being a soft reboot, but without it being so rebooty, it has to ignore everything else. I love this series, it's great. I definitely can't say the same for the next one, but Even so, it's got some high points, so I'll see you all next week with the 13th Doctor's era. Toodles!